Slavery is often understood as one of the most horrific aspects of American history. It is frequently referred to as the peculiar institution. Slavery was seen not only as an economic necessity, but a social need. By 1860, slaves made up approximately one-third of the population in the South. Slavery dominated much of the American economy, particularly in the southern states. Southern states produce approximately three-quarters of the world's cotton. The South's dependency on slavery slowed other forms of industrialization, such as railroads, which ultimately led to the South's failure in the Civil War to come. Slavery shaped the United States South both economically and culturally. Although the North was quicker to outlaw slavery, it was still massively supported. Northern companies created cotton shipments, bankers financed plantations, and Northern insurance companies provided slave insurance, as slaves were seen as an exceptionally valuable piece of property. The North was still very much economically dependent upon slavery. Slavery was supported massively throughout the white population in both the North and the Southern states, not solely for the economic prosperity it provided, but also for the social landscape it created. Slavery meant that regardless of wealth, even the poorest white had some level of legal and social status. Many Southern intellectuals attempted to justify slavery by arguing that it was beneficial to the slaves themselves, as they were clothed and fed, while others argued it was a necessary evil. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson argued on behalf of white solidarity and slaves by writing, "We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation is in the other." Slavery relied entirely upon intimidation, brutality, and dehumanization. There were many, however, who sought to fight the dehumanization of the peculiar institution, creating the Underground Railroad. Conditions varied amongst slaves depending predominantly upon their location. Those working in the rice plantations of South Carolina suffered extremely difficult conditions. However, they worked through the task system, meaning that once they had reached their required amount of work, they were able to pursue other activities, including cultivating their own lots of lands should their master permit it. In other areas, many slave plantations were based on cotton. Slaves on cotton plantations often worked in groups supervised by a slave driver or an overseer. This was back-breaking work in a very hot sun. Most slave owners typically had about 5 slaves. And massive plantations with hundreds of slaves were not as common as one might believe. There was also a market for renting slaves from other owners. From the beginning of slavery in America, the African slave population has tried to escape to freedom. Slaves fled to Canada, Mexico, native territories, and later the northern U.S. states following their decision to end slavery in the 19th century. Originally, escape plans were less structured, with many slaves simply following constellation patterns in an attempt to travel towards Canada and hiding in abandoned barns during the day. As the Underground Railroad was a secret while in operation, it is difficult to say when exactly or who exactly began the organization. However, laws written in the 18th century demonstrate that runaway slaves soon began to have helpers from white colonizers. Specifically, a law written in 1726 in Virginia banned the clandestine transportation of slaves by free citizens. Evidently, a primitive form of the Underground Railroad had begun by 1726, at least in Virginia. By 1815, the Underground Railroad began to solidify, reaching its peak in 1860. It was formed from a strategic line of farms running north from the southern slave states to the Canadian border. These farms were owned and converted into stations of the Underground Railroad. Some stations were a simple farmhouse, while others had underground tunnels and trapdoors to hide the slaves. The people who worked the Underground Railroad were known as operators. There were 3,000 operators, mostly who were white Calvinists and Quakers that felt slavery defied God's law and saw it as their duty to help free the slaves. They would provide runaway slaves with food and clothing, and some even had fake freedom papers or posed as masters to transport slaves to freedom. The most creative ruse said to be used was disguising a large group of runaways as participants in a funeral procession. People known as conductors traveled into the southern states in order to covertly advertise the work of the railroad. Conductors often used aliases by pretending that they were land surveyors, merchants, and/or teachers in order to gain access to plantations. Some wealthy conductors even bought up plantations in the South to pose as a slave farm, when in reality it was a station on the railroad. Between slaves, quilts describing the work of the Underground Railroad were passed from plantation to plantation, often with the help of conductors. The Underground Railroad was so successful by the time of the Civil War between 1850 and 1860, between 15,000 and 20,000 slaves had escaped. Roughly 3,000 slaves traveled through the Underground Railroad every year in the early to mid-19th century. The Underground Railroad has been the subject of a certain amount of myth-making. Because of the secrecy required for its success, there hadn't been a significant amount of documentation. It is uncertain how many slaves found freedom by way of the railroad, but it might have been as high as 30,000 or even more escaped slaves. The Underground Railroad's traffic reached its peak between 1840 and 1860, especially after the U.S. passed the Fugitive Slave Act. Conductors and operators on the Underground Railroad were not the only people who helped slaves achieve freedom. Free slave communities in the northern states helped to settle and protect slaves when they arrived, as well as hide them from catchers. Therefore, in 1850, in response to the epidemic of fleeing slaves, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. The act stated that all slaves who had escaped to the northern free states, where slavery no longer existed, could be captured and returned to the South. It also outlined harsh punishments for those who aided and abetted the fugitives. All citizens, both officials and civilians, were required by law to help the capture of a runaway. Law enforcement officers who did not arrest a runaway slave faced an $1,000 fine, while civilians caught aiding and abetting fugitive slaves faced the same fine plus 6 months in jail. The only requirement for a slave to be convicted of running away is an affidavit on behalf of their master, claiming he owned the slave and that said slave had left the plantation without permission. Slaves could not ask for a trial, nor could they defend themselves in court, leading countless freed blacks to be abducted and given to a master who they had never met based on a false affidavit. The commissioners who presided over these hearings were also paid $5 for every slave they let free and $10 for every slave returned to an owner. Bonuses were also given out to the arresting officer of a runaway slave, furthering the enslavement of free blacks. The Fugitive Slave Act made the business of slave catching highly lucrative, as bounties were placed on the head of slaves that could sustain a man for a year. Therefore, many slave catchers were ruthless in their efforts to capture a slave. Dogs were sent after slaves, and violence was continually used in effort to abduct the slaves and return them to their masters. Some pretended to be members of the Underground Railroad, only to turn the slave over to their master. Once the slaves were returned to the plantation, their punishment was up to their masters, and most were extremely gruesome, such as death, maiming, and torture. The Fugitive Slave Act created a larger challenge for travelers and operators of the Underground Railroad, as the free territory was now Canada. However, due to an outcry at the injustice of this act, the Fugitive Slave Act actually spurned greater membership of the Underground Railroad, with one Quaker willing to pay $8,000 in fines while helping 3,000 slaves to freedom. It seems the establishment of the Fugitive Slave Act in fact had an opposite effect of its goal, with more slaves escaping after 1850 than ever before. Throughout history, very few Africans have arrived directly from their ancestral homeland. The term African Canadian became increasingly popular in the 1980s to identify all Canadian descendants of Africa, regardless of their actual place of birth. The earliest arrivals were slaves brought from New England or the West Indies. Between 1763 and 1865, most black migrants to Canada were fleeing slavery in the U.S. A significant amount of white Canadians were not happy about the influx of fleeing slaves because it resulted in less land and necessities, such as food, being available for the white citizens in Canada. William Still is often called the father of the Underground Railroad because he helped roughly 800 slaves escape. Still also kept records of each person he helped save, including their new identity, biography, and destination, so that he could help reunite family members separated by slavery. Still was the child of a free black man and an escaped black woman who grew up in New Jersey. However, he had 4 biological siblings who were slaves born while his mother was enslaved in Maryland. Levi Coffin was a white Quaker who was unofficially called the president of the Underground Railroad. Working in Indiana and Ohio, it is believed that he helped 3,000 fugitives escape. His home was even referred to as Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad and was outfitted with secret doors and walls to hide slaves. Not only would Coffin take fugitive slaves into his home, but he would also help ferry them to freedom in converted wagons. Coffin and his family were frequently threatened by slave catchers, though this did not dissuade Coffin from what he felt was his religious purpose. Laura Smith Haviland was a white Quaker woman who lived in the newly acquired Michigan Territory, where her and her husband were active in the anti-slavery movement. After her husband's early death, Haviland continued to shelter runaway slaves in her home and even escorted some to Canada herself. Haviland became a conductor and traveled into the South to help slaves escape. She showed great bravery in a time where women were expected to be meek, even escaping from a slave owner who held her at gunpoint. Another time, there was a bounty placed on Haviland's head for $3,000. She also faced a slave owner in court whose slave she had helped escape and won her case. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland and later escaped to Philadelphia. Immediately upon her escape, she returned to Maryland to successfully free her family. This was the beginning of what would become Tubman's life work, guiding slaves along the Underground Railroad to freedom. Over the course of her lifetime, Tubman made 13 trips south and never lost a single person. She was nicknamed Moses for her ability to free the slaves. Throughout the narrative of the Atlantic slave trade, slaves are commonly perceived as passive and docile. However, there were a significant number of resistance movements, including that of Nate Turner, who with a group of approximately 85 slaves in North Carolina, marched between plantations killing the inhabitants. The Underground Railroad was an act of resistance against the slave industry. The state's response of creating even stricter laws, such as the Fugitive Slave Act, failed to contain this resistance, and actually inspired more helpers of the Underground Railroad. In one of the bleakest moments of American history, there are great examples of bravery and humanity. Heroes like Harriet Tubman were forged in this injustice, from a group of people who refused to accept inequality as the status quo simply because it was. It is estimated that tens of thousands of slaves were freed through the Underground Railroad, which is a strong reminder of what a united people can achieve in the face of injustice.